All right, picking back up where Mr. Carter's fat finger left off. Go ahead, Thomas.
I kind of want to comment on what Darius said about how it shows like the advancement of women. I think it's interesting to note that the books are kind of opposite to what you would expect. And Waiting for Godot, women aren't even mentioned that I know of. That just it's all men in the book, and so women don't even play a role in that book. And then where you'd expect women to be the most put down is in like a Middle Eastern country in a Muslim society. It turns out that the woman's the main character, and it's talking about her struggles and how like free, actually just kind of free she is when she gets by herself. And then in Sorrow of War, we see that women are actually almost treated kind of subservient. They're treated as less than men, like men to protect women. They, Kian and his friend at one point wouldn't shoot women even though they had guns and were trying to kill them. They shot them and told them to surrender, but then they wouldn't finish the kill until the woman actually done something. And he woman he found in the burned city like traumatized him for life, but we wouldn't really expect that as much in like Vietnam with how he was describing previous war, how like rough he was and how rough everything was. You would expect him to be, I guess, more like callous to it, and for Vietnam to almost be more like progressive in that aspect, but they really weren't.
Cool. Go ahead, sir. Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say women are pure in both those novels like you were saying.
So in other words, like, and even in Story of Zahra, where the main character should have the prominent role, we feel like she's almost subservient to the men that are in that book, as well as the more prominent women. I think even Zahra's mom plays a more prominent role than Zahra does at times. In other words, like Zahra has to be an understudy to her own mother. Go ahead, Anna.
Things that the story of Zahra, you kind of see a different perspective on women there, because, like they were saying, women are seen as like these quiet, humble creatures, and yet you read a story like that, and you have a mother who has general affairs or outside of her affairs.
Mm-hmm.
You have Zahra who's picking up on that, so you kind of see how what we perceive as that culture may or may not really be what's going on.
Okay. We got Mary.
Well, if we're talking about women as symbols, we could possibly, in Sorrows of War, you could say that the three farm girls could be seen as peace or some sort of leisure to the soldiers, because they help them get away from the horrors of war by offering their services. And so yeah, in that story, they're seen as sort of like a buffer against everything.
Have we seen that in any other stories that we've read this year, where women are a source of peace or a source of removal from a problem or removal from society? Out stealing horses. I think we see that a little bit. We also see it with Chronicle of a Death Foretold. So this isn't an uncommon... Mary brings up a good point. Good job, Mary. Mary brings up a good point that, these women may have minor roles, but they have a clearly bigger purpose from a cultural standpoint. Go ahead, Daniel. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, kind of branching off the topic of women, Anna kind of said, basically the cultural ideas that you have may not be exactly what's going on, and I was thinking sort of on that path, we could also look at religion as seen in the works.
Okay.
Because with Waiting for Godot, obviously there's always that debate as to whether Godot is really God or not, to which the author says it's not, but obviously there's a lot of allusions put in there, and there's a lot of nods to the Bible, such as at the very beginning with the stories of the two men on the cross alongside Jesus Christ. But at the same time, they also ridicule it for being, useless in their attempts to help themselves. And then with Zahra, we have sort of a wrathful goddess seen through, all of the characters being punished by them, or, simply wishing to die because of the fate that they were given by God. And as for the Sorrows of War, I think it's kind of polarized between the two ideas, because on one hand, while they do ridicule it, they also do look at it as a genuine source of faith and possibly even good fortune.
Okay. Well, speaking of good fortune, obviously we talked a lot about luck and the fortunes that we see in Sorrows of War. Do we see any other cultures focus on good fortune or luck in the other two stories? So in either Waiting for Godot or Story of Zahra, or is there more of a control there? In other words, they're not looking for luck; they are looking to create their own path. What would you say, Anna?
I think in Waiting for Godot, there really isn't any luck really placing. Like either that or it's really bad luck.
Okay.
Just waiting for something constantly that's never going to show up. And I think they try to create their own way, like with what's his name? Whatever.
Pazzo, is that what you're thinking of? Okay.
Pazzo, like how one day he wasn't blind, and the next day he was, and how things are constantly changing to try to get to Godot, but you never get there.
Okay. Mary, what you got, ma'am?
I think in Waiting for Godot, when it comes to luck, it's kind of funny to think about because, like, when they
Awkward pause.
because like when Estragon and Vladimir saw the rope hanging from the tree, like they saw this, oh, we have something to do, let's go hang ourselves. And instead of like, oh, that's a rope, maybe we can use it for something else that might not kill ourselves. Like things that are deadly or things that are seen as a deeper meaning that we would see, they don't see it like that.
Okay.
And that to them is luck, but to us it's like, what do you do?
Which is interesting because you could say the same thing about Kien and his way of dealing with his ways of dealing with death, right? In terms of being able to cope and finding his ways, whether it's smoking the herbs or drinking, or as Mary pointed out earlier, the women, they found a way to avoid looking at death as exactly what it is, which is death. What about Zahra? Is there any examples where she looks at it differently? Go ahead, Beline.
I think Zahra wanted to make her own path because she was trying to find love, but at the end it did end up being bad luck because when she actually found it, she died.
Yeah. So in other words, she becomes instead of becoming a heroine, she's a tragic heroine. Like she does all the right things and it ends up being the wrong one in the end. Go ahead, Thomas.
I'd say like in Story of Zahra, it seems like her entire path and her life is based off luck. Like when she was in Africa and then managed to come back. Luckily, then the war started. It sounds kind of ironic to say, but luckily the war started and she was able to be independent because all her family moved out and she stayed behind. And then luckily she met this sniper who would protect her because he wouldn't shoot at her, and then would also love her, and that's what she was looking for. And then luckily she wanted to commit suicide at one point, and then I guess it sounds kind of weird, but luckily she didn't have to give birth to the child she didn't want to give birth to until the last minute. So I think I'd say her entire story and her life is based off the luck and chances that she takes.
Okay, great. What you got, sir?
Sorrow of War with Kian.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that luck plays a role in there because he was one of the last ones to die out of his platoon. So.
And he also, what did his friends all encourage him to do? To gamble, right? And he kept winning. We're expecting Kian to lose, and he keeps freaking winning. Okay? Yes, ma'am. Or yes, sir.
I was going to say with Zahra, personally, it seems a bit absurd to just chalk it all up to luck because especially in part one of the story when we're learning about her early adulthood and her childhood, we see that she leaves a lot up not to luck but to fate. She kind of lets things happen to her and rolls with the punches, whether in a good manner or not. Kind of just she lets things happen around her and then reacts to those as opposed to carving her own path or even just hoping for something better.
Okay. And I think Daniel brings up a good point. I mean, if we look at culturally, especially based on what we've learned in the books, do you think most cultures are focusing on luck or fate?
I think so.
Kyle, why do you think it's both?
Because faith and luck are both powerful forces within all the stories.
Okay.
And they both play a role in culture, which is also a heavy factor within these stories too. So I guess in Kian's situation, he has faith and luck on his side. And because of that, I guess it gives him a sense of a survivor's guilt.
Okay. Which we're accustomed to because we had that same survivor's guilt in Mouse with Vladik and his surviving the Holocaust, and even Mala, who goes through, who redirects her survivor's guilt into a little more anger, where she's like, I had friends that died too. It wasn't just him. So I think it's interesting that survivor's guilt is something we see culturally, and I mean, again, Kien feels survivor's guilt because all of his friends have died around him. I think Zahra has some survivor's guilt because she's survived some very traumatic incidences. And we can even look at Didi and Gogo. And I think if we look at them at times, it's like when they can remember it, there's still that idea of they feel guilty for not being able to do more. And whether they're survivors or not, it seems to be that way, because even if when we go from Act 1 to Act 2, we see a transition from Pazzo being a commanding, dominant male figure to a weak, blind, person who is totally subservient to his, that was a long bell, that's totally subservient and dependent on the person that he was in control of before. So in other words, Lucky, it almost becomes a role reversal. Not to mention his name is Lucky. Go back a couple questions. So, Cassie, what were you going to say, ma'am?
With Lucky, with what Thomas was saying earlier in the conversation of if women were involved in Waiting for Godot, I would figure Lucky would have been a woman, because in that time period it was women do this for the men, women do that, and it's the women who are pretty much slaves to the men.
Yeah, and even when we watched the film, Lucky had a long hair. It was very beautiful and stringy. And again, it was almost like when you let him loose, what was he able to do? Talk. And he was able to really communicate all these ideas. But because he's so captive most of the time, Lucky's ideas become this 4-page stream of consciousness that Andrew was able to spew out for us so eloquently. But again, it was an opportunity for him or her to finally speak his or her mind, and all of a sudden it's this jumbled, garbled mess, which, when we look at, culturally, women have been suppressed because we assumed that they talk too much, or the stereotype had been they just ramble about nothing.
Yeah, it makes it seem like
Shh. Sorry.
they don't know much about what they're talking about, so they're just saying stuff, and then it makes it seem like we just.
Right, and then if you look at the way Pazzo treats Lucky when it comes to that, he really pushes that idea of, we used to have beautiful conversation, but now, he was exasperated by it. Yeah, almost, very much so. Go ahead, sir.
Sydney said that it was that they didn't really know what they're talking about. I don't think it's really that. I think it's that they're getting so many ideas so quickly, and then now they're able to actually, say what they're feeling. It's that rush of wanting to be heard.
Yeah, it's like making up for lost time, right? And if any time has been lost, it's definitely in Waiting for Godot. Go ahead, Mallory. I got you in the back.
Women being suppressed and not being able to speak their mind kind of ties back into Zahra being crazy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She didn't really tell anyone how she felt. She just kind of took it and went with it. So I think the whole suppression thing that ties into Lucky being crazy too. You can never say anything. You just held it all in, and all this came out.
Right, and I think you make a good point of that's what we kept asking that question: is Zahra crazy? Is she crazy? And I think if you think about it in terms of, again, if we go back to those gender stereotypes, Zahra was just being what? A woman, right? And so I think it's interesting that when we look at that suppression of information that Mallory brings up, that we look at it and say maybe that was what was crazy, because who did she have to talk to? Nobody. And as a woman in the Middle Eastern culture, from what we've been learning, she couldn't go to her husband with these problems. She couldn't go to her lover with these problems. So she has no one to turn to. So the only person she can turn to is herself. And then when we think she's talking to herself, we start to think that she's crazy. So it becomes a paradox that is unavoidable for these women in this culture. Daniel, what were you about to say, sir?
I was going to say, when it comes to the slavery, the subservience, the bondage, that arguably one could say the whole Sorrow of War could kind of fall into that category because everyone is sort of just waiting for another war to happen so that they could go back into their assigned roles, such as Kien, for example, who can find pleasure in nearly nothing back during a peaceful time and says that peace is only a filler for war, to the point where he spends almost all of his time writing war stories and reliving all of the pain.
So you could almost say, you know, that he's a masochist. He's someone that feels better by feeling pain. And I think that's important to think about because we see, especially in all three of these stories, our main characters love to relive through the painful parts. You know, I mean, even Gogo and Dee Dee like to talk about how, I think it's Gogo, it's beaten every night while he's asleep. Why would that be the one thing you want to bring up? So I think we bring a good point to that, and it also ties back into kind of what Kevin had mentioned earlier about both. You know, it seems like all of these worlds really parallel or really toe the line about being that existential movement. I mean, Kien wants war to happen because it's the only thing he knows. Whereas, you know, in Waiting for Godot, there's nothing to think about for tomorrow because tomorrow could bring the end of the world through war. Especially in that post-World War II time. Cody, go ahead. You've been waiting patiently.
What I think is very interesting about that is how Kien can't forget the past, but then Vladimir Estragon can't remember the past. So I think that's really time definitely plays a role in it.
And I think Stephanie and I talked about this the other day. What time frame, if we're, you know, in Waiting for Godot and Zahra and Sorrows of War now, we've really seen a shift away from one of our three time frames, and that's what we see things in the past. Obviously, we never look at the future. Why is that? Who thinks they can talk about that a little bit? Why might it be hard for us to look at the future? Because clearly most of our characters live in the past or live in the present, and a lot of them live in the past. So, Cassie, I'm going to let you start this one off.
I think, like, we don't hear about the future that much because, like, since they live in the past, they don't want to imagine their past reoccurring in the future.
Okay. So, in other words, we're avoiding that reciprocated, you know, violence that we talked about where one generation passes it on to the next. Lauren, what were you about to say?
I was going to say that I think that it's avoided because sometimes you don't know if you're going to be able to handle the future, but they've survived the past, so they can say, okay, it was painful, but they survived it. And sometimes when you think about the future, your mind kind of goes crazy and goes through a bunch of different things that could happen. So like what Cassie said, they don't want it to repeat, but they also might not know if they'd be able to handle it.
All right. Mary, go ahead, and I'm going to come back to this side of the room.
I think that in a lot of the stories, they didn't want to think about the future because it's not promised and it's uncertain that you'll have one. So like, if you start making assumptions, oh, this is what's going to happen, you never know. Because if you look back in Waiting for Godot, they kept waiting for Godot, and oh, he'll come tomorrow. He never came. So like, you never know if what you think in the future is actually going to happen.
Yeah, and how long and how far away is tomorrow, right? Go ahead, Daniel.
I was going to say that I don't think they really ignore the future to the extent that, like, we've discussed, because when it comes to the Sorrows of War, we really talk about the inevitability of having more war, and like the inevitability of death, especially when it comes to his neighbors around him that slowly start dying over time. And then with Waiting for Godot, I believe they also talk about obviously waiting a whole lot, and they also talk about things that, again, are inevitable to happen, such as you mentioned earlier, Estragon being beaten.
Mm-hmm. So there, you had your hand up a second ago. Did they cover it for you? Okay, Thomas, go ahead, man.
I think also, like, the reason they don't really look to the future is they don't want to get their hopes up that the future's going to be better.
Okay.
Because like in all three books, they've all had like traumatic pasts, and so like when you get your hopes up, even though they may not be high at that point because your past has been so bad, it doesn't take much to get high hopes. But then it's even harder when you get let down when your hopes are high. So for example, like Kien, he could look forward to a glorious new Vietnam underneath his new regime that he fought for, but then he can also think back to the past about how bad it was in the old Vietnam, and so that reminds him that his hopes may be too high, so he doesn't want to even approach the fact that his hopes are just way way to out of his league because even though his league's really low, it's still out of it.
Gotcha. Great. I'm going to let you and Sarah wrap us up back there, and then we're going to stop our discussion for the day.
Coming off of hope, I think that if your life is full of pain and you constantly live in problems, why would you expect that to change?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, ma'am.
When I was born again, I was just gonna say that, like he doesn't really go in the future because like his friends told him to gamble, and when he gambles, you live day by day, and you don't really think about the future, you think about the events that happen every day.
So the moral of time in all three of our stories is YOLO. All right, guys, thank you for a great discussion. What we will do is, again, we'll go into reflections. And remember, I need to state this for our people that aren't here. Remember, the reflection is on what you've learned through our discussion. And it needs to be 300 to 400 words. Thank you guys for participating.